What's the one thing that breaks a man when no one's watching? At exactly 4:17 a.m., the hallway light flickered on. Not because he needed it, but because the silence had gotten too loud. The floor was cold, but he didn't flinch. Just bare feet on tile. The refrigerator hummed in the dark. The curtains didn't move. Not even the wind bothered him anymore. Thomas hadn't spoken in 3 days. Not a word. Not even to himself. The house held that kind of stillness that isn't peaceful. It's thick. Like time got stuck somewhere between yesterday's coffee cup and tomorrow's unopened mail. The dishes sat clean in the rack, untouched. His coat hung on the doorknob, not worn in weeks. Everything in the space seemed paused. Like it was waiting for him to decide if he was still living here, or just passing through. He poured water into the kettle. Not to drink. Just for the sound. Steam rose, faded. No music. No phone. Just the slow burn of another morning that looked exactly like the last. Outside, the street lamp buzzed against the early fog. No cars. No footsteps. Just the orange glow over an empty road. His eyes followed it out of habit, not curiosity. He knew nothing was coming. On the table, a pen, a lighter, a spoon, a small mirror, a photo of himself he never framed. The objects sat like clues, like he was trying to remember something about himself without asking. He touched none of them. He walked to the window. Not to look out. Just to be near something thin enough to feel like a barrier, not a wall. His breath fogged the glass, briefly, then disappeared. Like everything else. Men don't scream when they fall apart. They hum. They flick switches. They stare. And sometimes, they just stand in the middle of a quiet kitchen at 4:17 a.m., asking nothing, answering even less. No one saw it happening. But it had already begun. He was the man who had it together. That's what they used to say. Reliable. Steady. The kind who paid bills early, called his mother on Sundays, showed up to barbecues with extra ice and paper plates. He wasn't exciting, but he was solid. And for a long time, that was enough. Enough to keep people close. Enough to stay needed. Enough to feel useful. But usefulness isn't the same as connection. And slowly, the things that tethered him began to fade. The invitations slowed. The check-ins became one-sided. The office closed. The woman he once loved left a note, not a conversation. "I don't feel you anymore," it said. Not angry. Just final. He stayed in the apartment. It was easier than explaining anything to anyone. He told himself he liked the quiet. That it gave him space to think. But the truth was, there wasn't much to think about anymore. Just long hours and the echo of his own patterns. That's when the first trigger appeared. Not a dramatic one. Just the drawer in the kitchen that wouldn't close. It stuck every time. He had meant to fix it for months. One evening, he pulled it open and it jammed again. He yanked. It caught. He yanked harder. Something snapped, not just the drawer, but something inside him. He cursed, loud. Then louder. Then kicked the cabinet so hard his heel bruised. Then silence again. It wasn't about the drawer. That's the secret most people never see. The thing that makes men lose control alone isn't big. It's small. Insultingly small. A burnt piece of toast. A phone that won't charge. A light that flickers. These aren't problems, they're proof. Proof that nothing listens back. That the world isn't built to hold a man when he's no longer performing. He cleaned up the splinters from the drawer, barefoot. Quiet. Chest tight, not from rage, but from the realization that no one would know this happened. No one would ask about the bruise. No one would say, "You okay?" in a way that meant it. He put the pieces in the trash. Washed his hands. Poured another cup of coffee. Sat at the table like it hadn't happened. And somewhere inside him, the next trigger quietly clicked into place. It came again a few days later, while folding laundry. The corner of a shirt wouldn't line up right. He tried again, smoothed the fabric. Still crooked. He sighed, then started over. The fifth time, he stared at the shirt like it was mocking him. His hands clenched. He tossed it across the room, not in anger, but in surrender. It landed near the radiator, lifeless. He stood there, arms still mid-air, like something inside had frozen in place. He didn't pick it up, just stepped over it on his way to the sink. It stayed there for 2 days. The shirt wasn't the problem. The problem was how quiet the room was when it happened. No voice saying, "It's just laundry." No eyes to meet his with that soft, grounding look. No one to pull him back with a joke. The quiet didn't soothe. It swallowed. It turned inconvenience into indictment. The third trigger came at night. A light bulb went out in the hallway. He had more bulbs. He knew where they were. But instead of replacing it, he sat in the dark, looking at the dead light like it had betrayed him. He whispered, "Of course," under his breath, not with drama, but with resignation. As if even the electricity had decided it was done showing up for him. Men like him don't collapse dramatically. They unravel in maintenance. In the decisions they stop making. The small deferrals that pile up until the house feels heavier than grief. He didn't tell anyone. Not because he didn't want to. Because there was no one to tell. The friends he once had were busy with their families. The colleagues he joked with now exchanged birthday emojis once a year. The woman he once loved probably thought he was fine, because he always seemed fine. He kept being fine. That was the most dangerous part. Every unwashed dish, every curtain left drawn, every postponed call, they weren't just signs of laziness. They were quiet symptoms of a man who was slipping, inch by inch, behind a curtain no one even noticed was there. That's how it happens. The secret triggers are never dramatic. They're the things no one else sees. The drawer, the shirt, the bulb, the absence of witness. He started spending more time in the hallway. Not walking, just standing. It was narrow, dim, and didn't ask anything of him. There were no windows, no clocks, just walls that didn't care if he leaned on them. He liked the way the shadows gathered there in late afternoon, how the light from the living room spilled in at an angle that made everything look softer, unimportant, like the world had blurred just enough to let him rest inside it. That's when the fourth trigger arrived. The voicemail. He hadn't checked them in weeks. But that day, the blinking light on the phone caught his eye. One message. Just one. From his ex-wife. Her voice, gentle but distant. "Hey. Just wondering how you're doing. Haven't heard from you." No pressure, just checking. He replayed it. Twice. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Like someone being careful not to step on a bruise. Her voice didn't carry love anymore. Just kindness. That quiet, terrible kindness reserved for people you've given up on but still pity a little. He didn't call back. Didn't delete it either. Just let it sit there, unread but known. Another ghost in the house. That night, he opened the freezer and stared at the frozen meals stacked in a neat row. All the same brand. Same flavor. 5-minute instructions. He heated one up, but halfway through eating, he stopped. Not because it tasted bad. Because he realized he couldn't remember the last time he looked forward to food. Food had become function. Sleep had become delay. Music had become memory. He thought about the voicemail again. Not the words, just the space between them. The part that sounded like she wanted to ask, "Are you still in there?" but didn't. Because maybe she already knew. He opened the window, let the cold air spill in. It stung a little. He liked that. It meant something still reached him. There was no panic. No breakdown. Just a slow erosion. A man chipping away at himself without noise. Without audience. Losing control doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes, It looks like nothing at all. The fifth trigger was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed against his skull like static. It came late one night when the power went out. No hum of the fridge, no low buzz from the street lamp through the blinds. Even the heater stopped its gentle clanking. Just absolute, airless stillness. He stood in the center of the living room, unsure whether he had gone deaf or whether the world had finally stopped trying to reach him. He lit a candle, not for comfort, but for orientation. The flicker cast long, swaying shadows on the ceiling. They looked like arms reaching, or maybe waving goodbye. He sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest like a boy who had just realized the monster under the bed might be real, and might speak in his own voice. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked from room to room, not searching, just moving, as if his body needed to prove it still existed. He opened the fridge even though it was dark inside. Flushed the toilet just to hear water. Rubbed his hands together to remind himself of warmth. The power returned at 3:42 a.m. Lights buzzed back to life. The heater sighed. But by then, something in him had gone completely still. Like the world had tried to restart him too, and failed. The next morning, he showered but didn't change clothes. Sat in the kitchen with his head in his hands, not crying, not thinking, just holding the weight of every moment he didn't express. Of every bruise the world wouldn't see because he hadn't bled. That's the secret most won't say. Men don't lose control in explosions, they lose it in quiet agreements with their own disappearance. One drawer. One voicemail. One cold silence too many. And now, he was starting to forget what it felt like to be witnessed. The sixth trigger was sound, but not the kind you expect. It was the sound of laughter. Not his. Not anyone he knew. Just laughter from a neighbor's apartment through the thin walls. It came on a Saturday evening, sharp and sudden, and it cut through him like a voice from a world he no longer belonged to. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, frozen meal long gone cold. They were laughing at something simple, probably meaningless. But it sounded full, alive, loud in a way that made his own silence feel unbearable. He muted the TV, sat in the dark, waited for the laughter to stop. It didn't. He wanted to bang on the wall, to shout, "Some of us are drowning over here." But he didn't. He just sat with it. The spoon still in his hand, his face blank. The sound of other people's joy had become a kind of violence, because it reminded him that he was no longer part of that world. Not because they pushed him out, but because, somewhere along the way, he stopped showing up. When the laughter finally faded, he walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, stared at himself. Not with sadness, with confusion, as if trying to remember how this face had once belonged to a man who was loved, needed, seen. His reflection didn't blink. He reached for the sink, but missed it slightly, his hand trembling just enough to betray him. That small tremor sent a shock of clarity through him. It's not one big fall. It's the 100 tiny slips you pretend aren't happening. He backed away, sat on the edge of the tub. A grown man, fully dressed, knees apart, hands on thighs, staring at the floor like it might offer him instructions. But there were none. Just the humming return of the fridge, the rustle of wind outside, and the echo of laughter he couldn't unhear. That night, he wrote something on a piece of paper, folded it, tucked it into a drawer. Not a suicide note, not a letter to anyone, just a line he needed to put somewhere outside his own head. I don't know who I'm supposed to be now. The seventh trigger was a smell. Old cologne, his father's brand. It came out of nowhere, maybe from a coat he hadn't worn in years, or a stranger passing on the sidewalk below. But it hit him like a wave. Not nostalgic, not sweet, just sharp, uninvited. It pulled something from deep within him that had been asleep far too long, the memory of being a boy in a man's world, taught to endure, taught to hold, taught to never need. He sat down hard on the floor, right where he was, his back against the wall, breath uneven. That scent didn't carry comfort. It carried instruction. Don't cry. Don't speak. Don't fall apart where others can see you. But now, there was no one watching. And still, he couldn't allow himself to break. That's when he realized, the most dangerous triggers are the ones that don't just remind you of what you lost, but of the rules you still obey, even in solitude. He spent hours there. No music. No movement. Just the air shifting around him and the scent lingering like a ghost of expectations he never agreed to, but still carried. When he finally rose, something was different. Not healed, not resolved, but quieter. Like the part of him that had been screaming silently had used up its last breath. He walked to the mirror again. Same eyes. Same tired lines. But something in the way he stood felt heavier. And somehow, more honest. He didn't call anyone. Didn't journal. Didn't post. He just whispered into the stillness, "I feel like I'm vanishing." The room didn't answer. The world didn't shift. But the act of saying it, the risk of naming his own unraveling, was its own form of resistance. He brushed his teeth, made the bed, turned off the overhead light and left a lamp on low, then sat beside it, not to be comforted, but just to be lit. Just to remember what it looks like when something refuses to go completely dark. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't brace for the next trigger. He just breathed. The next morning, he woke up before the alarm, not from habit, but from quiet. A different kind. Not the silence that bruises, but the kind that feels like space. Like something new might grow here, if left undisturbed. He didn't rush to get up. Just lay there, listening. The hum of the fridge. The subtle creak of pipes warming. The whisper of wind against glass. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt a degree softer. He sat up. His feet touched the floor. No urgency. No ache. Just contact. In the kitchen, he boiled water. Not for instant coffee, but for loose leaf tea he found at the back of a cabinet. He steeped it slow. Watched the leaves swirl. It smelled faintly floral, almost unfamiliar, like something once meant for guests that never arrived. He drank it at the table, back straight, hands wrapped around the mug. He didn't scroll. Didn't fill the space with noise. Just watched the steam rise and vanish. And for once, he didn't feel like he had to chase it. Then, without deciding to, he opened the window. The air was cold, fresh, and sharp against his skin. But he didn't close it. He stood there, letting it touch his face, his arms, his chest, bare, rising and falling like he was finally remembering how to breathe on purpose. In the corner of the room, a plant he'd forgotten to water had somehow survived. Its leaves were limp, but green. He touched one gently, whispered without irony, "Still here, huh?" It felt ridiculous and real. That afternoon, he cleaned out a drawer. Not out of necessity, not out of control, just to know what was still his. Old receipts, dead batteries, a key to something long gone. He didn't throw everything away. Some things he just moved, organized, not to fix the past, but to create a little more space in the present. And when the drawer closed, smoothly, this time, it didn't trigger anything. It just made a quiet click. Later that day, he found an old shirt, the one he had thrown by the radiator weeks ago. It was still there, crumpled, dusty, forgotten. He picked it up slowly, ran his hands over the fabric. The crease where it had folded itself was sharp like a scar. But instead of tossing it into the hamper, he smoothed it with care. Took it to the sink, soaked it gently, and hung it near the window. Not to erase what had happened, but to give it a second life. Quiet redemption. He didn't talk to anyone that day. Didn't share, didn't announce. But he noticed things. The way light shifted across the floorboards. The sudden sound of a bird landing on the railing. The breeze moving through the window without needing permission. For dinner, he cooked something warm. Not just heated, but cooked. Chopped onions, cracked eggs, listened to the oil hiss. It filled the room with smell, with presence. He plated it slowly, sat at the table, ate it like a person who deserved flavor again, and then, after dishes were washed, not immediately but in rhythm, he walked down the hallway, the one he used to pace in numbness. But this time, he walked slowly, intentionally, touched the wall with his fingertips as he passed, not to steady himself, just to feel. He stood in the middle of the apartment, not because he was lost, but because it no longer felt like a holding cell. It felt like a place he could exist in without proving anything. He didn't feel better. Not exactly. But he didn't feel gone. That was enough. He lit a candle, not because the power was out, but because it brought a softness to the walls. He sat beside it, not seeking answers, just warmth. The kind of warmth that doesn't fix you, but stays long enough for you to begin fixing yourself. In the distance, laughter rose again, from the same neighbor's apartment. This time, he didn't mute it. He didn't flinch. He let it pass through him like wind through a screen, heard, but not harmful. There are no breakthroughs, just moments. And this was one of them. The next morning, he made 2 cups of tea. One for himself. One he set across the table. He didn't speak to the empty seat. Didn't assign it a name. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't hope. It was practice, of presence, of preparation, of quiet hospitality for whatever life might someday place in that chair, even if it was just sunlight. He opened the closet and took out a sweater he hadn't worn in years. It still smelled like cedar and dust. He shook it loose, folded it, and placed it in a bag of things he no longer needed to carry. Not out of denial, but because he was ready to travel lighter. By midday, he was fixing the loose hinge on the bathroom door. The same one that had creaked for months. The sound used to remind him how alone he was. Now, it reminded him he still had hands, still had tools, still had time. The old routines returned, but differently. He wiped the kitchen counter not as a chore, but as a gesture. He washed his face slowly, shaved not to impress, but to feel the blade remind him where his jaw still was. He no longer feared the triggers, because he began to recognize them not as attacks, but as signals, invitations, to pause, to feel, to respond with something other than collapse. One evening, he stood at the window during golden hour. The light touched everything like a secret. It didn't demand, it just arrived. He stood there with a quiet chest. No grand insight. No narrative arc. Just a sense that he had stayed long enough inside himself to find something that didn't need to be named. And maybe that was the healing. Not to become someone new, but to finally become real. He didn't tell anyone he had made it through. There was no post, no phone call, no sudden return to the world. He didn't need to prove survival. Survival had become his language. Not loud, not proud, just woven into the way he folded his socks, the way he watered the plant without watching it grow, the way he turned off the light before bed like someone who trusted the dark again. He no longer looked for triggers. He no longer braced. If they came, they came. And when they did, he met them like weather, noticed, endured, and then released. That was the quiet superpower no one saw coming. He still lived alone. Still ate most meals in silence. Still heard the distant laughter of strangers through the walls. But now, it didn't sting. It didn't bruise. It just existed, parallel to his own quiet, not in competition with it. There were days that passed like fog. Others that shimmered with strange grace. He didn't chase the highs anymore, nor did he dread the lows. Instead, he let the days shape themselves around him. Soft, honest, human. Sometimes, in the evening, he would write letters he never sent. Not out of longing, but as ritual. As a way of making space inside himself. "I'm still here," he would write. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the page. Just to the air. And then one night, after weeks of nothing remarkable, he caught his reflection in the window, and saw a man who had not vanished. A man who had weathered 7 silent collapses and was still standing. Not stronger, not newer, but whole in the most human of ways, cracked, softened, awake. He smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't ask to be seen, just felt. Then turned off the lamp and let the room go dark again, this time without fear. If you, too, have stood in the quiet, folded laundry that folded you back, stared into the hallway hoping it would blink first, leave a dot. Not for noise, for recognition.